History is written in blood, bone, and skin. Beyond the abstract lines of maps and the text of grand treaties lies a visceral record of physical endurance. We are fragile vessels. To survive, the human body requires a constant stream of fuel, a skeletal structure that can withstand trauma, and an immune system capable of fighting off invisible, microscopic predators. Every empire you have ever studied was built by pushing this delicate biological vessel to its absolute physical extreme. Our civilization is the result of 4 biological arenas: the repair of our broken flesh, the fueling of our bodies in hellish environments, the marking of our skin to protect our identity, and the microscopic vulnerabilities that topple the world's most powerful thrones. Humanity's earliest surgeons attempted to cure trauma by drilling directly into the human skull. Without anesthesia or sterile tools, trepanation was a desperate gamble against intracranial pressure. A moment of wonder. This procedure was survivable. The smooth, remodeled bone growth around these 3 drill holes shows that the body successfully healed, proving these ancient patients lived for years after the surgery. Ancient Egyptians transitioned wound care into a systematic methodology. They utilized a specialized toolkit of bronze instruments to drain abscesses and packed injuries with honey, a substance modern science confirms as a potent antibacterial agent. In ancient India, the physician Sushruta developed reconstructive procedures like rhinoplasty. Long before modern labs, he established a structured empirical approach to rebuilding the human face using skin grafts. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like al-Zahrawi consolidated this global knowledge. His manuscripts illustrated over 200 surgical tools, turning battlefield trauma care into a documented, repeatable science. Modern medicine was forged in the dirt of ancient battlefields, born from the urgent requirement to survive catastrophic physical damage. In the trenches of World War I, empires faced the logistical nightmare of fueling millions of bodies in a toxic, waterlogged environment. Command reduced human survival to caloric math. They issued industrialized rations designed for shelf life over health, rock-hard British biscuits and German bread stretched with sawdust. For Indian and African colonial troops, the math was even grimmer. They were often issued rations that were culturally alien or strictly forbidden by their religious faiths. These soldiers resisted this culinary erasure by improvising. They foraged for local spices and balanced combat helmets over small trench fires to cook traditional stews under heavy artillery fire. In a world of mud and gas, cooking was a defiant act. It was a way to hold on to a cultural identity that the machine of empire was actively trying to flatten. While some preserved their culture through food, others carved it permanently into their skin. In the ancient Balkans, the Illyrian tribes used the body as a living canvas of resistance. Using bone needles and ash, they inked their flesh with sunbursts, spirals, and eagles. These marks broadcasted military rank and ancestral lineage to every ally and enemy they encountered. The Roman Empire viewed these tattoos as a barbaric threat to their civilized order. During their conquest, they attempted to erase the practice, forcing the Illyrians into a Roman mold. But the tradition survived by going underground. It transformed from a public warrior's boast into a hidden symbol of tribal resistance, passed down quietly by Illyrian women for generations. The human skin became a subversive tool. By the time the Roman Empire collapsed, the Illyrian identity remained, preserved in ink that the legions could never fully scrub away. But the ultimate vulnerability of history is found in the blood. When Hernán Cortés reached the Aztec Empire, he brought a force that no armor could stop. Cortés was a master of political manipulation, turning oppressed subjects against the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Watch the speed of the viral contagion across the city. Smallpox swept through these canals just before the final siege, moving faster than any army could march. The disease shattered the Aztec social structure and decimated their military hierarchy before the Spanish swords were even drawn. Morale collapsed alongside the population. The collision of these two worlds was dictated by biology. A microscopic virus facilitated the erasure of an old world and the brutal birth of a new one. We see the record of these extremes in the wounded gladiator, the trench cook, the tattooed woman, and the emperor facing a biological apocalypse. The physical endurance and adaptation of the people who survived these moments sustains the legacy of civilizations far longer than their stone monuments. History is etched into our modern medical texts, our cultural recipes, our genetic immunities, and our skin. It is a living artifact. Our physical bodies are the surviving sum of thousands of years of human endurance. We are the story that the past left behind. To understand the world of Greek mythology, you have to look at the power dynamic. Mortals exist in a universe where their survival, their fortune, and their ultimate fate are entirely at the mercy of towering, indifferent beings. The gods hold all the cards. They wield prophecies that trap people in unavoidable loops. They manipulate the elements to drown ships, and they can even rewrite time itself. From the ground, humanity looks completely powerless. Look closely at this dynamic, though, and you'll find a glitch in the system. Because the gods are immortal and never experience harm, they possess a massive psychological blind spot. They literally cannot comprehend what it means to be vulnerable. We can see exactly how humans exploit this blind spot by looking at 4 specific cases where ordinary people use truth, memory, and personal sacrifice to outwit Olympus. In a universe where absolute authority sits in the clouds, human fragility actually becomes the ultimate weapon for reclaiming agency. Consider Daphnos, a poor farmer's son in Arcadia. After sharing his meager bread with the god Hermes in disguise, he receives a strange gift, the ability to tell 3 lies with absolutely 0 consequences. Hermes expects the predictable. Give a desperate mortal a tool for consequence-free deception, and they will inevitably use it to hoard wealth, create chaos, or climb the social ladder. Daphnos surprises him. When a corrupt king offers him massive wealth to use his final lie to frame an innocent man, the boy walks away. He chooses to keep his last lie unspoken. The gods cannot fathom restraint. Hermes failed to realize that to someone living a difficult, grounded life, a clean conscience holds infinitely more value than an unearned reward. This disconnect appears again at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. Here, the oracle commands a noblewoman named Philaea to marry her own mother's murderer, all to secure political peace for the city of Thebes. Apollo assumes mortals are driven solely by survival. To the god, humans will swallow any moral compromise, no matter how blood-soaked, if it means avoiding divine wrath and keeping their city stable. Philaea rejects the altar entirely. She sheds her own blood on the sacred stone, refusing the vow and choosing personal ruin rather than participating in a forced hollow harmony. The gods continually underestimate the human demand for justice. They fail to see that people will willingly dismantle their own lives to reject a peace built on corruption. We see the same miscalculation on the sea. When the defiant captain Thamyris claims victory at Troy without thanking the divine, Poseidon exiles him to an unnatural ocean, designed to strip away his memory and identity piece by piece. Poseidon's logic is simple. If you erase a man's past, you break his spirit and force his submission. Yet Thamyris accepts the loss. He willingly sacrifices the remnants of his memories to forge a completely new identity as the Unbroken, turning his punishment into a blank canvas on a quiet island. Olympus cannot comprehend the capacity for adaptability. While gods view the loss of history as total destruction, mortals know how to use that exact loss as the foundation for a rebirth. The final confrontation happens in this high mountain gorge, where an isolated orchard sits untouched by Olympus. Here, the mortal healer Andronicus and the moon goddess Selene share a love so profound they manage to pause time itself. Kronos, the god of time, intervenes to fix this disruption. He believes that by entirely erasing Selene from the world's history, removing her temples, her name, and her light, he will successfully erase their defiance. Human memory does not require divine permission. Even with the world forced to forget, Andronakos and the very soil of his orchard remember her presence, preserving her existence independent of the sky. Kronos fails to understand the endurance of mortal love. It survives and quietly blooms, even when the fabric of history is rewritten against it. Look at the difference in the arsenals. The gods rely on heavy-handed tools, inescapable prophecies, memory wipes, and the literal manipulation of time. Mortals counter with quiet, internal weapons: restraint, resilience, and memory. If we look at this visual comparison of divine and human existence, the core of the blind spot becomes clear. A life without limits, true immortality, is a life without meaning. Because the mortal line is finite, every choice cuts away a piece of that limited time. Every sacrifice, every refusal, and every act of defiance adds a heavy, permanent weight to a mortal's timeline. The infinite divine loop experiences nothing but frictionless repetition. In a universe governed by vast, indifferent forces, the gods might rule the heavens, but our agency and our chosen sacrifices are the only things that truly belong to us, making mortals the true masters of their own fate. We tend to view intimacy as a private, individual freedom. But in the past, human connection was a highly public affair, shaped entirely by the demands of communal survival. In a world without modern buffers, unregulated human behavior was a threat. A scandal could ruin a harvest, trigger a blood feud, or destabilize an entire empire. These boundaries weren't suggestions, they were survival mechanisms. To understand them, we must look at the invisible rules governing 4 very different worlds. The myth of the dirty raider vanishes when you look at the archaeology. Free men maintained their social standing with regular bathing and intricate bone combs. By medieval standards, they were exceptionally well-groomed. This discipline was encoded in their laws. The medieval Grogos Code treated poetry as a dangerous tool. Writing non-consensual love verses about a woman was a serious offense. If you implied she was available when she wasn't, you faced exile. This was a hyper-masculine culture built on dominance. If a man was accused of ergy, or unmanliness, his social reputation died instantly. A rumor of passivity in private life could trigger a legally sanctioned duel to the death. There was no such thing as physical privacy in a longhouse shared with the entire clan. Yet women held surprising legal power. A wife could secure a divorce simply by declaring it in front of witnesses at her doorstep. Viking romance wasn't a product of barbaric chaos. It was a community merger, strictly regulated by law and the constant threat of public shame. For a medieval peasant, survival left no room for individual agency. Life was a relentless cycle of labor, where your time belonged almost entirely to your lord. However, the church and nobility mandated dozens of holy days. These scheduled breaks interrupted the grueling cycle of fieldwork. Festivals like Carnival provided sanctioned misrule. By allowing peasants to mock the gentry, authorities provided an escape from the rigid social order. These were loud, physical celebrations. Villagers spent the day throwing cabbages, staging mystery plays, and sharing communal meals in the mud of the village square. By institutionalizing these moments of release, the feudal system allowed the peasantry to vent the frustrations of their station before returning to the field. On the geopolitical scale of the Crusades, connection was managed through the high-stakes code of chivalry. Saladin rose to power not as a warlord, but as a bookish, highly disciplined strategist. He realized that Muslim forces couldn't win while fighting amongst themselves. Through marriage, diplomacy, and immense patience, he stitched the fractured Islamic world together into a single unified coalition. His ultimate test was Jerusalem. When Crusaders took the city in 1099, they slaughtered the population. When Saladin retook it in 1187, his entry was strictly regulated and entirely bloodless. He ordered his soldiers to protect Christian shrines and personally paid the ransoms for poor captives who couldn't afford their freedom. This restraint secured his reputation for honor, even among his fiercest enemies. For Saladin, mercy was a deliberate calculation. It served as a stabilizing force in a region defined by constant religious conflict. In Edo, Japan, the Yoshiwara district was a gilded cage. It was a world explicitly designed by the shogunate to contain and sell a manufactured dream of intimacy. The high-ranking courtesans were trapped in a cycle of crushing debt. Within these walls, actual romantic love was forbidden, as it threatened the cold financial logic of the pleasure quarters. To reclaim their identity, these women used the arts. They exchanged hidden, highly coded poems with their clients, finding ways to communicate genuine desire within the strict rules of their performance. When the debt became insurmountable and the illusion broke, some lovers chose shinju, a double suicide pact, rather than endure their societal obligations. In a society that commodified every touch, choosing to die together was the only way these individuals could exert control over their own story. The litigious Viking divorce, the peasants' festival dance, Saladin's mercy at the gate, the courtesan's hidden verse. These are all methods for navigating the frictions of life. They managed how people lived together, worked together, and kept their societies from fracturing under the weight of survival. These rules demonstrate that human connection has never been entirely free. It has always been molded and restricted by the forces of its time. But no matter how strict the code or brutal the environment, people have always found ways to carve out moments of profound connection. History is often sanitized, replacing the friction of complex human lives with the polished surfaces of marble statues and tidy textbook narratives. King Henry VIII serves as the ultimate Renaissance golden boy in our collective memory, athletic, virile, and projecting an aura of divine authority that seemed unshakable. This public image was meticulously maintained to broadcast absolute power. Every detail, from the impossibly broad shoulders to the defiant stance, tells a story of a titan in total control of his domain. In reality, this curated portrait masks a horrifying biological truth. The architecture of the historical facade was already being built to cover a body that was rapidly falling apart. By his final years, the 300-pound king was a literal shadow of his former self. His legs were plagued by chronic, festering ulcers that leaked fluid and produced a stench so foul ambassadors dreaded being in the same room as his ankles. Maintaining the illusion required a state-mandated silence. Tudor treason laws made it a capital offense to predict the king's death, forcing his physicians to offer vague, sunny diagnoses while Henry rotted in his bed. The facade finally cracked during his funeral procession. Haste and poor embalming caused his coffin to swell with internal gases until it leaked a putrid fluid along the route to Windsor, an indignity so great that stray dogs reportedly gathered to lick the drippings. The court's frantic attempt at a cover-up reached its limit here. Absolute political power met its match in the undeniable forces of biological decay. Henry's decline followed a brutal logic. A jousting injury led to immobility. Immobility led to weaponized overeating, and the resulting chronic pain fueled the legendary mood swings that kept his entire court in a state of psychological whiplash. This suit of armor highlights the staggering scale of his physical transformation. Blacksmiths had to accommodate a 54-inch waistline, forging a steel shell to contain the sheer volume of the king's girth. Simply moving the king required an array of industrial machinery. Engineers designed cranes, pulleys, and reinforced chairs to transport him through his palaces, while attendants relied on emotional bribery just to coax him out of bed. When physical strength fails, authority relies on literal machinery and transactional loyalty. The cranes holding Henry upright were the physical scaffolding of a fragile myth. Beyond physical decay, ideological facades of statecraft work to hide moral contradictions from the public eye. Empress Messalina used the Roman expectation of female modesty as a tactical weapon. Her youthful, serene public image provided the perfect cover while she orchestrated political purges and engaged in scandals that Roman historians would whisper about for centuries. The American founding fathers built their own enduring facades, drafting eloquent defenses of liberty while managing lives defined by deep moral compromises. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, yet at Monticello, he maintained a private reality of slavery and a secret family with Sally Hemings, a fact hidden behind the neoclassical architecture of his estate for generations. Alexander Hamilton took the opposite approach to protect his political life. When faced with corruption charges, he published the Reynolds pamphlet, choosing to expose his adultery rather than let the public believe he had stolen from the treasury. The moral facade of statecraft demands constant reinforcement. Historical greatness often finds its footing on a foundation of profound hypocrisy. The final layer of the myth is the emotional facade. Stoic leaders and brilliant minds frequently used private letters to vent the deep insecurities and desperate longings they could never show in public. Napoleon Bonaparte, the ruthless conqueror of Europe, was entirely disarmed by his own heart. His letters to Josephine reveal an insecure, pleading husband, begging for the attention of a woman who often met his passion with silence. Oscar Wilde's public persona was always one of effortless and arrogant wit. That facade was completely destroyed by the 50,000-word letter he wrote from prison, a raw meditation on sorrow, lost love, and his own self-destruction. Ludwig van Beethoven's immortal beloved letter provides a rare look behind the masterful symphonies. The script is erratic, filled with frantic corrections. These words were born from sheer desperation and were never even mailed to the woman they were meant for. Private correspondence strips away the armor of legacy. Even the most powerful figures in history remain anchored to the impulses and pains of their own human hearts. We continue to cling to sanitized myths, often ignoring the messy truths that lie beneath the surface of the past. Pristine myths serve as brittle illusions, masking a raw and human reality that is far more complex than a statue can ever convey. The architects of the modern world lived as fragile, aching, and deeply contradictory humans. By accepting the wounds, the compromises, and the broken hearts of these icons, we find a more honest version of history. We realize that the future will be shaped by flawed humans, people just like us.
When we picture ancient history, we usually imagine perfectly sculpted marble statues, brilliant generals on horseback, and kings issuing decrees that shape the world. But a royal decree cannot physically dig a trench, or feed 1,000,000 commoners, or carry heavy goods across a blazing desert. As this diagram illustrates, the massive empires of the past actually relied on 4 hidden engines of civilization to function: discipline, sustenance, trade, and culture. To figure out how history was really made, we have to look past the throne room and focus on the dirt, the crowded kitchens, and the treacherous trade routes where the working class kept the whole system running. Take the Roman legionary. They operated as heavily burdened laborers, carrying a 90-pound mule load of gear. The fast rhythmic pace was brutal by design, weeding out anyone lacking stamina through sheer exhaustion before they ever reached a battlefield. And when the marching stopped, the real work began. Every single night, regardless of how exhausted they were, the soldiers grabbed shovels, chopped wood, and built a fully fortified trench and walled camp from scratch. This back-breaking labor was enforced by a terrifying system of discipline. If a unit disobeyed orders, they faced decimation, a punishment where soldiers were forced to draw lots, and the unlucky ones were beaten to death by their own comrades to ensure obedience. Rome's true superpower was its ability to weaponize synchronized physical labor and shared trauma. Back in the urban center of Rome, another engine was running. Millions of citizens lived in cramped, flammable apartment blocks with absolutely no kitchens, meaning they relied entirely on street vendors to survive. This is a thermopolium, the ancient equivalent of a fast food joint. These masonry counters featured deep, sunken clay jars called dolia,
where hot food was kept simmering for the masses. To mask the taste of inconsistent food and add crucial calories, vendors used garum, a thick, fermented fish sauce stored in these large ceramic amphorae. It was the salty, ubiquitous fuel of the Roman underclass. These bustling stalls served as a great social equalizer. Slaves, laborers, and disguised elites looking for a cheap meal stood shoulder to shoulder at the counter. This fast food infrastructure prevented the city of 1 million people from becoming a powder keg of hungry, rioting citizens. By keeping the capital fed, these vendors provided the urban stability that allowed the empire to function. This is a portrait of Marco Polo. While soldiers conquered territory, merchants like him endured grueling travel. Across deserts and mountains, acting as the essential bridge connecting the East and the West. When Polo reached the court of Kublai Khan, the emperor didn't use him as a soldier. Instead, Polo became a trusted emissary, an unmatched observer who collected information on local customs, taxes, and resources across the empire. This map shows the highly efficient systems Polo documented that stunned Europe, like the use of paper currency backed by gold, and a 25-mile relay postal network that allowed couriers to cross the empire faster than any European monarch could send a message. Polo's survival and meticulous note-taking served as a powerful information engine, permanently expanding Europe's economic and geographical worldview. In the medieval era, leaders quickly realized that physical force was insufficient to hold power. To maintain control, they needed social influence and public relations. That role fell to minstrels, the troubadours and jongleurs, who acted as the living archives and mobile media network of the Middle Ages. They possessed immense strategic value. Minstrels memorized noble lineages, composed propaganda to legitimize rulers, and delivered coded satire to rivals. This created a system of plausible deniability. A performer could spread treasonous political commentary from court to court, and if confronted by an angry baron, they could simply claim it was a harmless song. Long before the printing press or the internet, the minstrel was the ultimate engine for shaping public memory and controlling political narratives. The famous emperors eventually turned to dust, and their borders collapsed, but the systemic engines built by the commoners persisted. The logistical DNA of Roman street food continues to define Mediterranean cuisine, and Marco Polo's surviving accounts directly guided the explorers of the Age of Discovery. The minstrel's practice of encoding sharp critique into popular entertainment established a functional pattern for political commentary that still echoes in our modern media. History is held together by the daily grit of the grunts, cooks, merchants, and entertainers. These 4 engines, discipline, sustenance, trade, and storytelling, continue to drive our lives today, proving that the basic mechanics of human society haven't changed nearly as much as the empires that once claimed to own them. When we picture history, we usually see marble columns and grand monuments. We rely on the architecture of empires and the writings of kings to tell us who we are and where we came from. Because the written record is overwhelmingly maintained by the wealthy and the victorious, it leaves a massive void. The daily lives, the struggles, and the intellect of the marginalized, the conquered, and the poor are often left entirely off the page. To find the actual history of humanity, we have to look past the official documents. We have to search through alternative archives, the daily routines, the local myths, and the physical bodies of the people themselves. The endurance story of the RMS Titanic usually focuses on the luxury of the upper decks. First-class passengers enjoyed 10-course meals featuring peach compote and chartreuse jelly, surrounded by carved wood and fine linens. Down on F deck, the reality for third-class passengers was a dense collision of steamer trunks and a dozen different languages. For many, the expectation was steerage horror stories, dark, airless spaces shared with more rats than spoons. Instead, these passengers found a dining saloon with white-painted walls and electric lights overhead. To maintain order for 700 people, the kitchen operated like a factory, serving massive portions of boiled potatoes and dense stew in tightly timed shifts. This environment offered a level of hygiene and structure many had never experienced. There were tiled floors, real chairs instead of crates, and the smell of soap. By sitting at a bolted-down table and using actual metal cutlery, immigrants were treated as respectable passengers rather than luggage with teeth. This remarkable sense of order provided a rare moment of dignity before their arrival in a new world. Far below the crystal chandeliers, the simple, repeated routine of sharing a hot meal in a clean room functioned as a vital archive of social survival. Historical records often undergo a process of intentional erasure. For centuries, the intellectual contributions of women were systematically filtered out by male scribes, who maintained a monopoly on authorship. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 2300 BCE, a high priestess named Enheduanna rejected anonymity. She wrote a series of temple hymns and theological poems, and explicitly signed her work, declaring, "I, Enheduanna, composed this." It was a brazen assertion of authorship in a system dominated by kings and male priests. By the 4th century CE in Alexandria, the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia refused to stay hidden in temples or private libraries. She lectured openly in the streets and public forums, drawing crowds of students to learn geometry, astronomy, and Neoplatonic logic. In Han Dynasty China, Ban Zhao utilized a different strategy. Working within strict Confucian ideals that demanded female obedience, she used her role as an imperial teacher and mother to advocate for female literacy, ultimately writing essential chapters on astronomy and statecraft that completed the monumental Book of Han. While many of their original texts were destroyed or co-opted over the centuries, these scholars managed to encode their intellect into the very foundations of human philosophy, securing their archive in the margins of civilization. In 53 BCE, the Roman military suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Carrhae. While 20,000 Romans died in the desert, roughly 10,000 seasoned legionaries were taken captive by the Parthian Empire. And then the historical record goes completely dark. They simply vanished. Looking at this map of the Silk Road, you can track the immense geographical mystery. Some historians suspect the Parthians sent these Roman prisoners far to the east to act as border guards. Decades later, Chinese chronicles recorded a battle with foreign mercenaries fighting in a fish-scale formation, a tactic strikingly similar to the Roman testudo. Those early reports of foreign military tactics pointed researchers toward Liqian, a remote village in China's Gansu province. For decades, locals with unusually fair hair and light eyes have claimed direct descent from those wandering Roman soldiers, building an entire cultural identity around the legend. In the early 2000s, geneticists collected blood samples from the villagers to find the truth. The DNA results were inconclusive, showing markers typical of the diverse populations that have traveled the Silk Road for millennia, but no definitive proof of Roman ancestry. Ultimately, the factual accuracy takes a back seat to the phenomenon itself. When an army disappears and the official record fails, human belief steps in. The legend of the Lost Legion proves that communities will forge a powerful, lasting historical identity out of pure myth. Long before anyone pressed a stylus into clay or ink into parchment, marginalized and indigenous populations were maintaining an archive that could not be burned in a library. They used the human body. When hikers discovered Otzi the Iceman frozen in the Alps, they found 61 simple line tattoos across his 5,000-year-old body. Clustered around his joints and lower back, these marks aligned with areas of physical stress, suggesting a prehistoric therapeutic record rather than aesthetic decoration. By contrast, the Scythian nomads of the Altai Mountains used ink as a permanent ledger of elite status. The mummified remains of their nobles display elaborate, fantastical beasts curled across their shoulders and arms, ensuring their social standing traveled with them into the afterlife. In the Pacific Islands, the Polynesian tautau operated as a vast, living text. Using a handmade comb struck with a mallet, the tufuga etched a person's entire lineage, bravery, and spiritual connection directly into their skin over months of excruciating pain. Among the matrilineal Berber culture of North Africa, facial tattoos acted as complex maps of a woman's soul. Placed carefully between the eyes or across the chin, these geometric marks broadcast her tribal origin,
her maturity, and invoked spiritual protection. As colonizing powers and religious institutions spread across the globe, they viewed these living archives as threats. From North America to Japan to the Philippines, traditional tattooing was aggressively suppressed, outlawed, and criminalized. Yet, the ink endured. It survived in the shadows, passed down by elders in secret, proving that people will always find a way to record their honor and their lineage, using methods entirely immune to the fires that destroy official libraries. Human history survives through the endurance of the marginalized. It is found in the structured meals of steerage dining halls, the persistence of ancient female scholars, and the ancestral records etched permanently into skin. Humanity records its own story in the archives it refuses to let fade.
Medieval society operated as an incredibly rigid, geometric machine, where every single person occupied a predefined, inescapable role. The town torturer occupied a unique niche in this system, an employee with an official salary and job security, yet completely devoid of social capital. He lived as a permanent outsider, never receiving a friendly nod in the market or a seat at a neighbor's table. This anatomical overlay reveals the mechanics of pain math. Far from acting as a mindless brute, the torturer calculated specific stress angles, pivot points, and rotation limits. He knew exactly how many turns a joint could withstand before the skeletal system failed, requiring the icy precision of a specialized engineer. This precision carried heavy physical and social consequences. Townsfolk crossed the street to avoid his path, and even in his private quarters, he lived with the work. Because the dungeon's stone architecture offered no dampening, the delayed echoes of screams followed him home, vibrating in the silence for days. In this rigid hierarchy, professional necessity existed entirely apart from social acceptance. The torturer served the state as a vital tool, yet remained trapped in the untouchable margins of the community he helped maintain. This manuscript of a grand banquet depicts the high-stakes political center of the community, where physical placement at the table defined your standing in court. As this hall layout shows, the ceremonial salt acted as a hard social boundary. Guests seated above the salt occupied positions of highest trust. Social status and meal quality cascaded downward. While high lords feasted on peacock, distant guests fought over stale bread. The host used food and drink as strategic tools. A constant flow of wine lowered a rival's guard, while a pie that released live birds upon slicing, or a castle sculpted from sugar, served as a calculated display of absolute wealth and control. Behind the heavy tapestries, an invisible army orchestrated this theater. Thousands of spit boys and sauce makers worked in a state of high-pressure hierarchy, timing every remove to ensure the polished performance in the dining hall never faltered. Connection at the center of society functioned as a relentless game of visibility and risk. Every meal was a performance, and every seat was a political statement. The public bathhouse offered a rare break from these rigid formalities. These were sophisticated hubs of steam and warmth, featuring vaulted stone ceilings and copper cauldrons that supported a thriving communal culture. Inside, different social classes mingled in the water. Merchants negotiated trade deals over floating dining trays, while live musicians played for couples, sharing wine and pastries in the heat. Even without armor or robes, the system persisted. Wealthier patrons could pay for the privacy of separate rooms, and bathmasters managed the entire operation from the shadows, ensuring the fires never went out. This high level of physical intimacy created a systemic weakness. Shared tubs, recycled towels, and recycled water rapidly became highly efficient pathways for deadly infection, turning a safe sanctuary of cleanliness into a dangerous hub for disease. By the 15th century, fear of shared steam and water outweighed the benefits of the community. The intimacy that once defined the bathhouse ultimately provided the catalyst for its own destruction, transforming the town's social center into a source of catastrophe. these local vulnerabilities scaled globally along the Silk Road, a massive, punishing network of trails and mountain passes that stitched together entire continents. This trade network began behind the monumental architecture of the East, like the ancient city walls seen here in Xi'an. From these gates, rolls of silk and bundles of tea set out across thousands of miles. Survival depended on the caravanserai. In stone courtyards like this, merchants from different civilizations collided to swap pack animals, negotiate currency rates, and trade information in a dozen different languages. Women managed the essential heartbeat of this road, running the roadside tea houses, weaving the prized textiles, and acting as the diplomatic bridges that allowed different tribes to trade in peace. Ideologies and faiths traveled alongside the cargo. Monks and pilgrims founded sprawling repositories of culture along the route, like this Dunhuang cave temple, housing massive artistic and spiritual monuments that bridge the East and West. The same caravans that transported philosophy and porcelain also acted as the absolute perfect incubators for the plague. This manuscript of Victims in Bed records the terror that followed the trade routes westward. The Black Death moved through the very arteries built for profit, eventually collapsing the local social hubs like the bathhouses. In response, cities slammed their gates and raised new borders. They implemented harsh quarantines and severed the global connections that had once defined their wealth. From the isolation of the torturer to the global movement of the Silk Road, medieval connection was bound by invisible rules of risk. The networks that built the world eventually provided the paths for its destruction, proving that our human web has always been our greatest asset and our most dangerous liability. When we imagine history's worst tyrants, we picture erratic monsters, rulers indulging their darkest impulses and tearing down the rules for their own pleasure. But the historical record reveals a quieter, highly effective method of control. The most dangerous power doesn't break the rules, it writes them, building rigid systems that demand absolute compliance. To understand how this works, we have to trace a line across thousands of years, moving from the sun-baked monuments of ancient Egypt to the smog-filled industrial streets of Victorian London. Across these radically different eras, leaders who wielded absolute authority shared one essential tactic. They secured their survival by systematically erasing the agency of the individual. Unchecked power corrodes human freedom by deliberate design. It constantly rebrands its own justification, always with the same end goal: turning living people into tools, subjects, and data points. In ancient Egypt, kingship was wrapped entirely in religious symbolism. The pharaoh was the literal bridge between the gods and the earth, meaning their total control was framed as a sacred necessity for cosmic balance. Take Pharaoh Khufu. He commanded tens of thousands of people to work for decades on a tomb meant entirely for himself. Human lives were treated as abstract units of labor, expended to build a monument that declared his infinite self-importance. Later, Senusret III took that domination indoors. He relentlessly dismantled local power networks and managed the state with intense centralized surveillance. Looking at his official portrait, you can see the heavy-lidded, exhausted expression of a ruler who controlled everything down to the smallest administrative detail. Under this divine framework, behaviors that would shock a modern society were simply state policy. The massive sibling marriages of the Ptolemaic dynasty, or the staggering fertility of Ramses II, were treated as religious obligations to preserve sacred bloodlines. The general public absorbed these actions without hesitation. When the entire political structure tells you something is holy, criticism becomes heresy. There was simply no cultural room for alternative thought. A living God removes the possibility of resistance. When the ruler dictates the shape of the universe, their desires become sacred mandates, and the subjects beneath them lose the right to say no. Fast forward to 19th century Britain, and the disguise of absolute power shifts, moving away from cosmic divinity and anchoring itself in strict moral tradition. Queen Victoria's understanding of control began in childhood under the Kensington system. It was a suffocating, rigidly scheduled upbringing designed by her mother to enforce total psychological dependence and isolate the young princess. Upon inheriting the throne, Victoria took the rigid discipline of her youth and used it to rebrand the British monarchy into a highly curated symbol of domestic virtue and family respectability. When her husband, Prince Albert, died, her personal devastation became a public mandate. She retreated into a severe, permanent state of mourning, wearing only black for the rest of her life, setting the emotional rules for an entire generation. This projection of strict morality provided a highly effective ideological cover. While the Queen modeled idealized domestic discipline at home, the nation used that same rhetoric of civilizing order to justify violence and exploitation across a rapidly expanding global empire. Moral authority bypasses the need to claim divinity because it grants itself the power to define what is civilized and what is savage, forcing everyone else to conform to its standard. As the 19th century progressed, the ultimate source of authority shifted again. It moved away from religion and royal crowns, settling squarely on the shoulders of objective science. The American mental asylum system began with the optimistic promise of healing through structured environments, but it quickly hardened into a massive mechanism of social erasure, isolating society's unwanted behind thick stone walls. This chart maps the explosive population growth within 19th century asylums, fed by medicalizing standard human struggles like grief or poverty. Contrasting this against a flatlining ratio of doctors, we see the philosophy of individualized care collapse, replaced by mass warehousing. This institutionalization was supported by Victorian pseudosciences, which provided an intellectual framework for codifying social inequality as a matter of biology. One prominent example was phrenology. By examining the bumps on a person's skull, practitioners claimed they could read traits like aggression or kindness. Abstract human behavior was mapped to physical geography, categorizing morality as a measurable defect. These rigid categorizations laid the groundwork for extreme interventions like forced sterilization, justified as necessary for the public good. When oppression is labeled as biology, the subject is reduced to a defective data point. Scientific authority removes moral debate entirely, leaving the marginalized with absolutely no voice to object. Whether you were dragging limestone in the Egyptian desert, conforming to the moral demands of a Victorian empire, or disappearing into an overcrowded asylum, the mechanism of authority evolved, but the erasure of the individual remained a constant. These systems operate with a relentless mechanical efficiency, building walls that insulate power by locking out any deviation from the established rules. Absolute authority thrives on unquestionable certainty, and history leaves us with a quiet warning. Whenever a society prioritizes perfect order over everything else, our shared humanity is always the first thing sacrificed. Whether you were dragging limestone in the Egyptian desert, conforming to the moral demands of a Victorian empire, or disappearing into an overcrowded asylum, the mechanism of authority evolved, but the erasure of the individual remained a constant. These systems operate with a relentless mechanical efficiency, building walls that insulate power by locking out any deviation from the established rules. Absolute authority thrives on unquestionable certainty, and history leaves us with a quiet warning. Whenever a society prioritizes perfect order over everything else, our shared humanity is always the first thing sacrificed. When human beings first gathered in massive numbers, we faced an immediate problem. Survival required us to suppress our own chaotic nature. To build cities, cultivate crops, and maintain peace, early civilizations created systems, laws, empires, and ideologies that could organize a population. But those structures were heavy, and someone had to carry the weight. Around 1754 BCE, the city of Babylon attempted to organize that chaos. They realized that a society governed by the unpredictable whims of a king was unstable. To To fix this, they created one of the earliest codified legal systems in human history, designed to replace arbitrary judgment with visible, state-enforced order. This black basalt monument displays the Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone for all to see. But visibility did not provide equality. The system enforced a strict social hierarchy. If a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, his own bone was broken in return. But if he broke the bone of a commoner, the punishment was merely a fine. In ancient Egypt, justice was framed as a cosmic force called Ma'at, representing truth and balance. There was no single, rigid legal code carved into a pillar. Instead, justice depended entirely on the absolute authority of the pharaoh, who was tasked with maintaining harmony between the gods and the people. These early structures reveal a recurring dynamic in civilization. The moment a system of law is built, a hierarchy is born alongside it. The design dictates who wields the tool of the law and who is struck by it. Throughout history, royal courts operated on strict patriarchal rules. Daughters of the nobility were traditionally treated as passive bargaining chips. Their value was measured in dowries, diplomatic leverage, and their ability to bear heirs for a foreign throne. This classical marble bust captures Cleopatra, a leader who viewed these patriarchal constraints as a strategic landscape. She used marriage and motherhood as a calculated tool of statecraft. By aligning herself with Roman generals like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she secured Egypt's survival against Roman dominance for years. These polychrome tomb effigies show Eleanor of Aquitaine lying beside her second husband, King Henry II. Eleanor used her marriages to redraw the geopolitical map of medieval Europe. When her union with the King of France failed, she arranged an annulment and married the Duke of Normandy, shifting the immense wealth and territory of Aquitaine from France to England. This map illustrates a different application. By the early modern era, the Habsburg family controlled Spain, the Netherlands, and Austria. They annexed vast territories by arranging strategic betrothals, using wedding contracts to accomplish what usually required mobilizing thousands of troops. But the Habsburg strategy eventually hit a biological limit. To keep power strictly within the family, they relied on generations of inbreeding. The very marriages designed to preserve their empire ultimately led to health complications that collapsed their bloodline. These historical players achieved power by studying the rigged games of their time. They survived by becoming so effective within those patriarchal structures that they transitioned from being tokens of diplomacy into the architects of empire. While the elite manipulated the system, others were crushed by it. By the 19th century, the United States was consumed by manifest destiny, an ideology that framed national expansion as a divine right. This systemic hunger required the removal of indigenous populations from their homelands. The Cherokee Nation attempted to survive by adopting the system's own rules. They formed a constitutional government and defended their sovereignty in the U.S. Supreme Court. They won their case, but the legal victory proved hollow. President Andrew Jackson ignored the court's decision and weaponized federal law to force the relocation of Native American tribes. He utilized the Indian Removal Act to provide a veneer of legality to what was, in practice, a state-sponsored seizure of land. This monochrome illustration depicts the horrific reality of the Trail of Tears. Thousands were forced into a death march through freezing conditions. Without adequate clothing or food, entire families succumbed to pneumonia and exhaustion as they were herded west by the military. This map shows the geographic endpoint, a tract labeled Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, presented as a permanent home. That looking at how densely packed these nations were, the space was never secure. Soon, the government encroached on the very land they just assigned. The Trail of Tears illustrates what happens when an empire prioritizes expansion over justice. The law ceases to be an arbiter of right and wrong and becomes a tool for dispossession, leaving innocent people to pay the physical price. At the same time, thousands of pioneers were moving west along the Oregon Trail. These settlers believed they were acting with total individual agency, moving by choice to claim free land and personal glory. This photograph captures a pioneer family in front of their covered wagon. The romanticized promise of the West rarely matched the horrific reality of the trail, a 6-month journey defined by dysentery, exhaustion, and broken wagons. Pioneers had to pack their entire lives into a springless, rolling coffin pulled by uncooperative oxen. They slept on the ground and lived on salted pork and bug-infested flour, enduring a logistical nightmare that aged them by decades in a single summer. Manifest destiny exerted a different kind of pressure here. While the victims of the Trail of Tears were moved by military force, these pioneers were moved by an ideological lure. In both instances, whether through the bayonet or the promise of a land grant, the individual body was the engine that powered a nation's ambition. Systems of law and empire often appear absolute in their time. A stone monument or a federal act projects an image of permanence, but these structures are prone to erosion as national priorities and political tides shift. Andrew Jackson's legal maneuvers were designed to erase indigenous sovereignty, but they failed to erase the people. The Cherokee and other nations used the decades following the trail to rebuild their governments, schools, and communities, maintaining their identity into the present day. And the pioneers who survived the Oregon Trail, despite the staggering physical toll of the journey, managed to reshape the geography of the continent through sheer, grinding endurance. History is often recorded as a series of grand designs, codes of law, royal alliances, and federal acts. But the actual shape of that history was determined by the people who lived through those systems. The kingdoms eventually fell, and the laws were rewritten, but the descendants of those who survived the courts and walked the trails remain. In 1386, in the French town of Sleepless, a pig wandered into the street, attacked a child, and made legal history. It became the first domestic farm animal to be formally arrested for murder. Instead of shrugging it off as a tragic farm accident, the townsfolk held a full trial. The pig was chained, brought before a packed courtroom, and assigned a defense attorney, who presumably argued that his client oinked in protest. The judge listened gravely, declared the animal guilty of malice aforethought, and sentenced it to death by hanging at the local gallows. It is easy to look back at this and laugh, but to the people of the 14th century, this was a perfectly rational response. They lived in an era defined by a strict moral ecosystem, where true accidents did not exist. If something went wrong, someone or something had to answer for it. This case in Sleepless was an early glimpse at a legal system designed to manage an unpredictable world. When tragedy struck without warning, the law offered a way to force that chaos back into a recognizable, manageable shape. Assigning a pig a lawyer was a way to maintain the illusion of control. By forcing a chaotic incident into a procedural box, authorities ensured that accountability was always achievable, even if the logic required to get there was stretched to the breaking point. That intense desire to regulate the unpredictable bled into everyday life, often in response to incredibly specific incidents. In 14th century Bohemia, a bored nobleman commissioned a tiny set of plate armor for his pet goose and brought it to a jousting tournament. The bird escaped, bit a squire, and triggered a massive multi-horse pileup. The authorities immediately drafted a decree banning the arming of domestic fowl. A few decades later in Germany, Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg showed up to a tournament completely plastered, dropped his lance 3 times, and entirely missed his opponent, impaling a nearby monk instead. The local duke held an emergency council, resulting in Europe's first recorded regulation against competing on horseback while under the influence of fermented brew. Over in England, an ambitious baker embossed a decorative ring onto his artisan bread, making it look exactly like the king's crown. A royal official spotted it, accused the baker of insolent baking, and fined him heavily. Parliament swiftly passed a law dictating that no loaf could bear royal or sacred resemblance in shape. And in a quiet town along the Rhine, a shepherd with a talent for loud, late-night tunes spooked a noblewoman's horse, sending her plunging into the river. Within days, the town council outlawed public whistling after the toll of the evening bell. Meanwhile, in Prague, an overheated craftsman named Marek decided to repair the city wall wearing nothing but his work boots. When Queen Barbara passed by, he enthusiastically saluted her with his mallet. The city council rapidly introduced an ordinance requiring all artisans to ply their trade fully clothed. These hyper-specific regulations show a society that feared random chaos above all else. Medieval authorities spent centuries attempting to legislate away the messy, unpredictable nature of human and animal behavior. This desperate need for control didn't stop at the edges of the farm or the village square. It extended straight up to the heavens. The Church, the ultimate spiritual authority of the era, applied the exact same bureaucratic scrutiny to the supernatural. In 1324, a brand new bronze bell in the French town of Autun was struck by lightning, broke off its beam, and rolled down the church steps, crushing barrels and chickens along the way. The mayor ruled that the bell had fled its sacred duty, prompting a decree that all church bells must henceforth be bound with chains to prevent ungodly flight. When a farmer near Limoges claimed his cow was weeping holy tears, pilgrims flooded the village. The local bishop, frustrated by the unregulated spectacle, investigated and decided the event lacked spiritual merit. The diocese quickly passed the law of unapproved miracles, mandating that no divine event could be proclaimed without official episcopal paperwork. That same legalistic mindset traveled with the Crusaders when they marched east to capture Jerusalem. They were sworn holy warriors, bound by strict vows of poverty and chastity, but reality on the ground required a flexible interpretation of those rules. Behind the banners of the cross, knights turned the coastal ports and holy cities into immensely profitable black markets. They set up brothels near sacred shrines, smuggled stolen Italian wine, and sold fake relics, like sheep bones dipped in incense, to naive pilgrims. To reconcile their holy oaths with their highly lucrative sins, the church provided a literal accounting system. Commanders and knights could purchase indulgences, essentially buying forgiveness in advance by donating fortunes back to monasteries. The collision of medieval bureaucracy and the divine turned salvation into a quantifiable asset. Holiness became a ledger of weighed, measured, and purchased grace, often funded by stolen silver. At the very top of the medieval hierarchy, inside the glittering royal courts of Europe, the rigid illusion of order completely collapsed into silent, suffocating paranoia. Kings ruled by the sword, but those who truly survived learned to fear the goblet. Poison replaced the sword as the ultimate political weapon. It was quiet, it left no witnesses, and it gave rise to underground guilds of apothecaries who mixed fatal doses of nightshade and arsenic for ambitious nobles. The presence of these untraceable toxins turned the royal banquet into an exercise in psychological warfare. A sudden fever in a duke or a pale complexion in a queen became coded warnings. Trust was a deadly liability, and accepting a courtesy cup of wine from an ally could easily be your last act on earth. Unable to write a law that could stop a hidden killer, rulers invented a morbid, bureaucratic stopgap: the food taster. These servants were human shields, forced to sample every roasted meat and spiced wine. Their entire job was to eat, wait, and potentially die in agony, so their master could safely finish dinner. A king could draft 1,000 laws and command massive armies, yet all of that absolute power was instantly neutralized by a few grains of lead in a soup bowl. Thousands of miles away in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor faced a similarly treacherous, untrustworthy court. His solution was extreme. He outsourced his personal survival to foreign mercenaries from the frozen edge of the world. These were the Varangian Guard. Consisting mostly of towering Norsemen and exiled Anglo-Saxons, they patrolled the marble corridors, wielding massive two-handed axes. They spoke no Greek,
understood nothing of Byzantine court factions and could not be bribed with local political favors. They were bound by a sacred Norse oath tied directly to the emperor's throne, bypassing the complex bureaucracy of palace eunuchs and generals. Within an empire defined by backstabbing, the Varangians were straightforward. When ordered to execute a rival, they did so with mechanical precision. But their loyalty belonged to the office of the emperor, not the specific man sitting on the throne. If a ruler was legitimately deposed through proper legal channels, the guard adapted instantly. In one instance, they calmly escorted an overthrown emperor into monastic exile without laying a finger on him, perfectly obeying the law of succession. The Varangian Guard stood as the ultimate, ironic triumph of medieval control. To ensure the law was actually enforced, the most powerful man in the world had to hire men who lived entirely outside of it. From prosecuting rogue pigs, chaining down disobedient bells, to trusting Viking bodyguards, the era was defined by a desperate search for order. The rigid, multi-paneled structure of these manuscripts reflects a civilization defined by a form of hyperlogic. They applied exhaustive legal frameworks to a disease-ridden, war-torn reality, attempting to categorize every terror they encountered. These historical footnotes reveal a civilization doing exactly what we do today. They used paperwork, protocol, and laws to hold back an unpredictable universe.